Hi again, just me. Chapter 48, Pride and Prejudice. All right, let's look at question number 1. How are Mr. Bennet's letter writing habits described? They are dilatory. He is not a good correspondent. He is very negligent. He does not respond to people when they write him letters because he is more interested in just reading his books, which shows that he is not a good caretaker of his land, that he is not truly a very focused gentleman like Mr. Darcy, for example, who gets a letter and he sits down and he fulfills his obligations and he takes care of all of his correspondences. Mr. Bennet, he could care less. Let's look at number 2. Why would her uncle believe Lizzie might have knowledge of who Wickham's relations were? They believe this because Elizabeth at one point had basically shown that Mr. Wickham was one of her favorites. And so they assumed that they would have had these long discussions about family, but Elizabeth knew nothing about him. So that really shows that Mr. Wickham, that's just another example of his dishonesty because he doesn't open up and he wasn't truly the person that he pretended to be. Number 3, what insult does Mr. Collins, given his letter, which claims would have been a blessing compared to this? Oh my gosh, Mr. Collins, Mr. Collins! The death of your daughter would have been a blessing in comparison to her running off with somebody. So he is saying it would have been better for Lydia to be dead. Because at least if she was dead, then you wouldn't have to deal with all of the scandal and the rest of your family dealing with it. Yeah, you lost a child. Big deal. You cry. How sad for you. But what a horrible, horrible man he is. Number 4, what doesn't he, this is even worse. What does he then say he reflects on with satisfaction? He reflects on the fact, and this consideration leads me moreover to reflect with augmented satisfaction on a certain event of last November, for had it been otherwise, I must have been involved in all of your sorrow and disgrace. He's talking about Elizabeth rejecting him, and he's saying, whew, dodge that bullet. So glad she did not accept me and she rejected me, because if she'd accepted me, I would have been dealing with this family also, and all of your shame would have been on me. Ew. Oh, Mr. Collins, you're just quite the charmer, aren't you? Let's look at question number 5. Why does Mrs. Bennet now not want Mr. Bennet to come home? She says, sure, he will not leave London before he has found them. Who is to fight Wickham and make him marry her if he comes away? So this just is an example, and I kind of mentioned it in chapter 47, how Mr. Gardner said that it would be unexpected for Wickham to do this because Lydia is not unprotected. It was expected that if your honor was challenged, someone in your family would have a duel. Now, duels were illegal, but gentlemen still participated in duels, but they were kind of on the DL. And you did it in a field on the outskirts of town. And so Mrs. Bennet is saying, Mr. Bennet can't come home because if he comes home, then nobody's going to be there to fight Wickham. But just last chapter, she was saying he can't fight Wickham because Wickham is going to kill him and then I'll live in the hedgerows. Let's look at question number 6. What is the significance of Mr. Bennet's response to Lizzie's statement of him enduring sorrow? Oh, this is really good. Elizabeth says to her father, Elizabeth ventured to introduce the subject, and then on her briefly expressing her sorrow for what he must have endured, what Mr. Bennet must have endured while in London, looking for Lydia and Wickham, which he still hasn't found them, Mr. Bennet interrupts her and says, say nothing of that sorrow. Who should suffer but myself? It has been my own doing, and I ought to feel it. So as a reader, you're like, whoa, he's taken responsibility. Okay. All right. This is great. And Elizabeth says, Papa, you must not be too severe upon yourself. And his response is, you may well warn me against such an evil. Human nature is so prone to fall into it. No, Lizzie, let me once in my life feel how much I have been to blame. I am not afraid of being overpowered by the impression. It will pass away soon enough. So he's back to his old self. He's saying at first, I need to feel this pain. It's my fault. I've been a horribly ignorant father. I've ignored my daughters and let them run amok. And Elizabeth's like, Dad, don't be so hard on yourself. And he goes, it's not a big deal. It's going to pass anyway. And all this guilt I feel is going to be gone. And then I'm just going to be moving on. No big deal. So we think he's changed. We hope he's changed. And he does definitely feel shame, but he's saying, it'll pass. Not a big deal. Let's look at number 7. What showed greatness of mind on Lizzie's part, according to Mr. Bennet? Lizzie, I bear you no ill will for being justified in your advice to me last May, which, considering the event, shows some greatness of mind. Remember, Elizabeth said, Dad, do not let Lydia go. If she goes, she is going to embarrass the family. She is going to do something that will humiliate us. She will do something that will not just embarrass and humiliate the family, but will lead to our ruin. And Mr. Bennet was like, it's not a big deal. Just get over it. Just don't be such a prude. And then Mr. Bennet says, Elizabeth, it shows that you are more intelligent than I am. This is a greatness of mind that you knew this was going to happen. Question number 8, our final chapter question for chapter 48. What are the 4 stipulations Mr. Bennet gives Kitty? Because Kitty says, I am not going to run away, Papa. If I should ever go to Brighton, I would behave better than Lydia. And Mr. Bennet says, you go to Brighton? I would not trust you. It is near it is Eastbourne. So Eastbourne is also a seaside town. Brighton is a seaside town. So Brighton is kind of like Santa Cruz, where it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of young people there. It's kind of like a party town, where Eastbourne would be kind of like Carmel, where that's the older crowd. There's a lot of old people that go to Carmel because it's more expensive. And so there's not a lot of trouble to get into for young pups. And so Mr. Bennet's like, I wouldn't even trust you in Eastbourne. Like, I wouldn't even trust you in Carmel because you would get in as much trouble as your sister. And he says the following stipulations. Number 1, no officer is ever to enter my house again, nor pass through the village. Balls will be absolutely prohibited unless you stand up with one of your sisters. And you are never to stir out of doors until you can prove that you have spent 10 minutes of every day in a rational manner. Well, we know that's impossible. So Kitty breaks down crying, and Mr. Bennet says, well, do not make yourself unhappy. If you are a good girl in the next 10 years, I will take you to a review at the end of them. So I'll take you into London and we'll go see a play in 10 years. And obviously, Mr. Bennet, his bark is worse than his bite at this point because he's just going to fall right back into his old habits. So that is the end of chapter 48. I will go ahead and start on chapter 49.